Hi everyone, my name is Dylan Eustachi, and this is my analysis of Battleship Potemkin by Eisenstein. My overall opinions about this film were moderately mixed because I look at it from one, an entertainment standpoint, and two, because this is a Soviet film and that has a lot of really intense history from a historical standpoint, especially since one of the things I like the most about the film is that it is very blatantly a propaganda film, a piece of Bolshevik, my apologies, propaganda. Some things that I specifically like from the film were a lot of the low camera angles that were set, especially on the Battleship Potemkin. And towards the end of the film, there's one specific scene. The soldiers are getting ready to go into a battle where they will most likely die. And so the tone is very bleak, it's very dark. It feels as if the audience is disconnected for the first time from the people in the film, and we are kind of set backwards, like we are watching them from afar, like we are spying on them, like we shouldn't be seeing this. And they do this technique with a low camera angle, usually angled upwards towards soldiers up in crow's nests or on their positioning. And it creates a really eerie tone because we see them, but we aren't structured where the shot is straight on. We see them from far away, and it makes us feel really disconnected from the characters for the first time in the film. And that is very eerie and quite the tonal shift, I would say. I also really like how fast the editing often is. I think that is a really great technique to kind of keep the audience on its toes, especially with subject matter like this, when you're trying to get your audience to see the Tsarist government as a bad group of people and the Bolsheviks kind of as the heroes. Having a lot of action with hard cuts makes the audience a little disoriented and helps to really create that tone and the propaganda vibe that they were really going for. As I was saying, I really appreciate that this is a very intense piece of propaganda with its obvious bias towards the Bolsheviks being kind of the unsung heroes. And this starts off from the very beginning of the film with it starting with a Vladimir Lenin quote about war and then ending with imagery of brotherhood, and it's saying like, come together comrades, like yes, brothers, and really just a sense of community for the audience that would be watching. And so I really appreciate it as someone who is an avid lover of history, seeing this propaganda and how the filmmaker used it throughout the film. And as that was my overall opinion of the film, I do generally like it, but it was not the most entertaining film for me to watch. Next, I would have to say for a specific sequence that I thought had really exemplary editing was from the timestamp of 22 minutes and 10 seconds until around 23 minutes and 42 seconds. This is a scene where the crew members aboard the ship are supposed to be executing a group of condemned, I believe also soldiers. And it is a really tense scene because you can see just from the acting standpoint on the faces of the soldiers, you see anxiety, you see worry. They don't want to kill these people. They know them. And then you also get interconnecting shots with the captains just following their orders, following the government and going, no, you have to kill these condemned men. You see shots of the men's feet, them being covered with a tarp so they can't see death coming at them. And then finally you see cuts of a priest hitting a cross against his hand, praying for these condemned men. And it adds an overall just kind of eerie tone because a priest interconnected with all these things is quite the juxtaposition between guns and a priest. It's very interesting, but it creates a very tense tone. And in this scene, each shot cuts around like a second at a time. They are extremely fast cuts. Within the first 30 seconds, there's over 10 cuts of just back and forth from the condemned soldiers to the men holding rifles, to the captains, to the priest, to back to the men holding rifles. Different shots from different angles of the men holding rifles. It just creates a very distinct visual tone that is extremely stressful. And the real reason I think Eisenstein chose to do this with its quick cut editing was because when you do quick shots, you do not give the audience time to absorb and react to what is on screen. When you hold on a shot, the audience really gets to absorb what they are seeing and understand what is going on within that composition. But if you're cutting from the soldiers to the men with the sheet over them to the priest, all in this span of what is like 2 seconds, it makes the audience feel uneasy because they don't know what they're supposed to be paying attention to. And this really helps to connect the psychology of the characters to the audience, because when the audience is disoriented and they are nervous and they're anxious and tense because of the editing style, the quick cut editing, we understand how those men holding the rifles are feeling, because they don't want to shoot these condemned soldiers. That's why they are taking so long to fire. And even the captains are looking down to them to fire, but they aren't. And that really helps us to see the psychology of the characters. And I believe that this falls into one of the montage types, which was the tonal montage, because all of these shots, I feel, have very similar tones. They all are very bleak, is how I would describe it. They don't have a lot of flair within the composition. They are just sort of straight on. And I think this creates a very much a sense of realism, and the audience is supposed to obviously feel for these characters, for these soldiers, I mean. But I think that the tone of these overall shots being very bleak and dark, I think helps to really create the scene, give the scene a sense of unity, because we see each sequence next to each other and we understand that it is showing the inner moral quandary of these men for not wanting to shoot the condemned soldiers, but the overall hierarchy, the overall people in charge of them really want them to follow through with their orders. And I think this is very successful in doing what the montage's job is, of bringing us into the psychology of the characters and helping the audience to really understand what they're going through. And I believe that the editing, the quick editing, as I previously explained, also really helps with this sort of feeling and creates a very effective picture. As for my reading on Ellis, I was very interested in the director Eisenstein's background with Japanese culture. It wasn't something that I would immediately think would be connected to a Russian director, since Russia obviously has a very tumultuous history, and I would think that they'd be very focused on their culture and on themselves when they were figuring out what they were doing with their government. So I was interested to see that Eisenstein had a very big background with theater, and especially with Japanese art and theater. One specific part of art and Japanese culture that he used in his filmmaking was he used how the Japanese used ancient hieroglyphs to affect how he cut scenes. One specific thing being he would take what the Japanese would use as the word for sing in hieroglyphics, being a combination of the bird hieroglyphic and the mouth hieroglyphic, and when it combined together, it made singing hieroglyphic. So he would apply that same concept to his filmmaking, where he would combine one shot with another shot, two completely different shots, and they would combine to create a new meaning, to create a new emotion within the overall picture. He also used Japanese painting techniques within his shot composition. Japanese painting is very different than any other sort of art technique amongst Western and European audiences alike, because it's very focused on simplicity and making sure that the composition is very, as I said, simple, but very focused on itself at the same time, where the text used the example of a single cherry blossom branch having the detail be on each branch. It's very interconnected, but also very separate and spacious. That is a big part of Japanese painting culture. And he would use this within his shot composition to really drive forward a story with simplicity in his shots and not overcrowding them. And the last thing he got from Japanese culture, according to the book, was using kabuki theater to help his storytelling. The text mentioned that one of the main aspects of kabuki theater, especially this type of performance called, I believe, ko, is that motion is just as important in the overall storytelling as dialogue is. And they compared it to Western storytelling, which is extremely dialogue heavy, and really just showed the juxtaposition between the two. And Eisenstein would use this sort of kabuki technique to really show that motion was just as important, and in some points could create even more emotion, like the scene I was talking about previously with the soldiers getting ready to shoot the condemned men. You could see within their emotions, they're unsteady with their rifles. They don't want to shoot them, but they obviously can't say anything. It's a silent film. You can see the emotion on their faces and on their movements that they are feeling that hesitation. And all of that inspiration Eisenstein got from kabuki theater and Japanese culture. And I thought overall that was just extremely interesting. As for my overall takeaway, having watched the film and done the reading, I have mixed feelings about my personal enjoyment of the film, because I enjoy the intellectual context of the film. I enjoy the historical context of the film, being a lover of history, and the fact that it is a piece of Bolshevik propaganda. but I was not very entertained. I thought the plot was kind of slow, except for the scene on the Odessa steps. I thought that was absolutely beautiful cinema. Obviously, the class explaining that it was one of the most famous scenes pretty much of all time. But I really enjoyed the editing style. I'm typically a fan of quick cut editing. I do love thriller movies, and that is usually the style of editing used in that. But overall, I thought the film was good and a really, really effective piece of propaganda, because by the end, I really hated the Tsarist government, especially after the Odessa step scene. My overall score, I would probably say, is a 6, because I was not entertained by the overall film, which puts on the lower end of the spectrum, but I did enjoy the historical context and what the film made me feel, so that makes it a little bit higher. So I landed somewhere in the middle, right around a 6. Thank you for watching.